Okay, thank you everyone for joining and attending the CalChiro and HIPAAmate webinar today. As a reminder, please ensure all your devices are on mute. This webinar will be recorded and sent to you afterwards. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jeff Brown. He is dedicated to making HIPAA easy. Dr. Brown's career spans private practice, compliance consulting, and software product management for 3 healthcare technology companies. He is CEO and co-founder of HIPAAmate, a compliance software designed and priced for small practices. So with my pleasure, Dr. Brown, please take over.
Great, thank you very much, Kaylee. Hello, my name is Dr. Jeff Brown. I am a chiropractor just like you, and I am super excited to be partnering with the CalChiro, California Chiropractic Association. Dawn reached out to me about a month ago, maybe a little bit longer, and we talked about what it is that I'm doing, what I'm trying to do for the profession, and she was right on board. She put a proposal together for the board, and they accepted it, and they said, hey, let's get HIPAAmate on board with being a partner of ours. And part of that partnership, of course, is that you as a CalChiro member receive a discount on the HIPAAmate software, which I will show you all later. But I just wanted to throw that out there in case you weren't aware of that. So there's a nice little discount for you. And again, we'll talk about that later. So again, I am a chiropractor, and just give you a brief history about why in the world I talk about HIPAA compliance and why did I even get into this? Because most of us, traditionally, I should say, do not like HIPAA compliance. We despise it. In fact, it's usually because it's this burdensome thing that we have to do on top of all the other stuff that it takes to run a practice. I completely understand that as a small business owner, you have to spend as much time as possible doing revenue generating activities. And let's face it, HIPAA compliance is not revenue generating. Therefore, in my opinion, as it is, I'm sure yours as well, you must spend as little amount of time as possible on HIPAA compliance, again, so that you can maximize your time with patients. So I was in practice. I graduated from Sherman College back in 2003. I went into practice for about three and a half years. At that time, well, that was kind of the beginning of HIPAA. Even though HIPAA's been around since the 90s, kind of it really showed up a lot more on our radar back in 2003 and 4 and 2005. I actually took a fork in the road and I started doing some consulting for an EHR company, which led to me getting into software product management, which I absolutely fell in love with. I did that for 4 years. Then I ended up taking a job here in Columbus, Ohio, which is where I am now, working for a telemedicine startup. I was their director of product management. Learned a ton. Again, I enjoyed it so much because I worked with software and helping to create software to do something useful. However, I don't know if this is good to say or not, but me being a chiropractor, there was something wrong with working for a telemedicine company, and that's because, as I discovered, telemedicine is just a more efficient way to prescribe medications. So I looked for the door and I found it. I left after 2 years and I started practice. I went back into practice. I had been out of practice now for close to 7 years, and I'm opening a practice again, and I knew I needed to be HIPAA compliant. So I go to the normal routes. I'm looking at seminars. I'm looking online for different help for HIPAA compliance. And I was honestly shocked that HIPAA is being done. So this would have been in 2016. HIPAA compliance was being done the exact same way it was when I left practice back in 2007. I was shocked. In 7 years had gone by and HIPAA was still being done with manuals and seminars and consulting and all of that. And I worked for software companies for 7 years, and I knew software would solve this problem, which is HIPAA being extremely confusing. And because it's so confusing and time consuming, we tend not to do it. Most chiropractors, in fact, most healthcare providers are not HIPAA compliant. You're not alone. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I saw this as a huge problem because HIPAA is hard, it's confusing, it takes time, and when you go look for help, it becomes very expensive. And again, software solves this problem. So I set out to build HIPAAmate, which is what I did. I took together all my software experience. I partnered with a software engineer from the telehealth company, and we built HIPAAmate. We launched in we launched this year back in February, so only 10 months old. And I will show you the software later. But before I do that, let's go into something that I like to talk about when I discuss this topic, are this concept. I call it the HIPAA hazards. When I go out and talk to providers, not just chiropractors, but dentists and MDs and mental health counselors, etc., I often hear that I ask them, what are you doing for compliance, or are you compliant? Oh, yeah, we're good. And I started to compile a list based on what I learned from that experience, where people believe that they're compliant, and this is why it's a hazard. Thinking that you are something that you aren't can be a hazard, because you're coasting through practice thinking you're good, and you're not. So we're going to discuss those. Before I do that, though, I kind of forgot to mention this early on, is that I have one goal. My goal is to reduce the anxiety that is out there in the market, or just in chiropractic, regarding HIPAA compliance. It really isn't very difficult. It really isn't. And I'm hoping that after just 1 hour with me, you will start to kind of take a deeper breath and realize, oh, okay, HIPAA isn't that hard. It shouldn't be. In my opinion, software is what solves this. It is hard if you try to do it via manuals and spreadsheets, etc. Okay, so the HIPAA hazards. The first one, this is by and large the most common one, and that is when you think or you believe, hey, you know what, I have a HIPAA manual. I have my policies and procedures manual, and therefore I must be good. I'm compliant because I have my manual. Well, unfortunately, no, HIPAA's not that simple. If it was, it wouldn't be a headache. But anyway, a manual is actually or I should say, having a manual is not the only thing that you need to do. And I will show you all the stuff that you need to do. But this one here, even if you have a manual, most offices are not using this, or most offices don't have a compliant manual. So I started practice in 2000. I graduated 2003. I opened my doors early 2004. And what I did was what I hope, I don't know, maybe not, but what I did was what a lot of people did back then, is I knew I had to have a manual. That's one of the things that stuck with me. Okay, I have to have a HIPAA manual. And so I went to a colleague who'd been in practice, a few more years than I had, and I borrowed theirs, and I basically put my name and address on it, and I put it on a shelf, and it sat there. Unfortunately, that's not compliant. From a HIPAA standpoint, you have to have a policy and procedure manual, which I will show you that later, but it needs to actually be reviewed and approved on an annual basis. And that's where most of us kind of fall short. We may have a manual and it sits there and it's been sitting there for years, but we don't actually review it and then approve it, or really just document the fact that, so-and-so looked at each chapter and signed off on it, that it was approved again. That is something that you want to do, is make sure that it's updated. It's not that you have to edit stuff every year. You just have to make sure that you've looked at it and you review it and sign off that you reviewed it. Policies also, the other place that I fell short when I was first in practice. Policies are not generic. You can't just share a policy from one office to the next, to the next, to the next. They need to be custom to your location. That doesn't mean the entire thing has to be custom, because there are a lot of parts of a manual that are shared among thousands of offices, but then there are other areas, and I'll give you a couple examples later, that must be custom to your office. So therefore, you really can't just duplicate one from another. Even if you are a doc that has multiple practice locations, you actually want to have a separate policy and procedure for each location, because HIPAA is very location driven, and maybe I can get into some of that later. Okay, HIPAA hazard number 2 is staff training. This is where someone says, hey, I have a manual. Okay, good. And then review it all the time. Good. And I also train my staff, and therefore I must be compliant. And so my first question is, how do you do training? And if the answer is, well, we hire a service, we pay $25 a person, and we watch online videos, and then we take a little mini quiz, and then we get a certificate at the end. Well, unfortunately, that is not compliant. And the reason for that is because throughout the HIPAA guidance, which Health and Human Services has out there, they are throughout that they actually they indicate that your HIPAA staff training or your annual staff training needs to cover your policies and procedures. Now, this does not mean that you just give your staff a policy manual and say, here, read this, because that would be extremely boring and not very effective. But there are specific parts of your policy manual that you want to do training. For example, password management training. It's called out in a few places that you train your staff on your password management policy. Well, you can't watch a video on that because your password policy may be that you require, let's say, a minimum of 10 characters and you have to have like one number and one capital letter or something. Whereas the practice across the street might say, oh no, our minimum is 8 characters and we don't care if there's any special characters. So training actually is specific to each location. So just be aware that online videos, while it's kind of nice and it gives you a warm fuzzy that you have a fancy certificate for each staff member, unfortunately you paid money for training that isn't compliant. But again, I will show you that later. I do not want, and I'm really hoping, even though it's really hard not to be, to get overwhelmed with HIPAA because there is a lot of information, but I'm really trying to let you know that please don't worry about this, and I will show you why later, but it really isn't difficult. Unfortunately, just the topic itself can be overwhelming, but it doesn't have to be. The next HIPAA hazard, I'll try to breeze through this just because I definitely want to get in and show you the software itself, but I also want to have time at the end where I can answer questions because I'm sure you will have some. So the next hazard, or the last hazard, is one where I hear this a lot, which is, oh, I'm good because I have a consulting firm or I have a consultant or I use another product that does HIPAA for me. And I pay them a bunch of money, and so therefore I must be HIPAA compliant because they say I am. I want to really caution everybody, or if anybody is using a consulting service or a software out there, I want to caution you that, and the question really is, are you actually compliant? And the biggest reason that you may not be, in fact, by and large, you're probably not, even though you're paying someone to do it, is this thing called a risk analysis. I think we all have heard the term risk analysis, especially if you're in the EHR and the incentive program days. Remember the whole meaningful use stuff? HIPAA, there's a very big difference between a risk assessment and a risk analysis, okay? They are not the same thing. Absolutely not the same thing. The risk assessment is actually something that's called the gap analysis, okay? And it's not required by HIPAA. It's not a requirement. You don't have to do one of these. In fact, I say don't do one because legally it can be an issue if you actually don't follow through with after you do one of these things. Whereas the risk analysis is actually the HIPAA requirement. The problem is the word assessment and analysis get interchanged by vendors out there. In fact, most vendors, unfortunately, will interchange those two, and they inaccurately believe that these are one and the same, and they're not. There is a free tool on the government website, on HHS website, that they have this risk assessment tool. Most consultants, in fact, all consultants that I am aware of, and almost all software vendors that I'm aware of, actually have their customers, you do something called a risk assessment, and they're mimicking the free tool that's out there on the government website, thinking, again, in error, that the assessment tool is the risk analysis, and it is absolutely not. So I say this, and when I built HIPAAmate, the software, which I'll show you, I knew this, and I was kind of in the dark. I was kind of one of the only ones, except for one other compliance vendor out there called Clearwater Compliance. The two of us, as far as I was aware, were the only ones who were actually doing a risk analysis for people. So that made me nervous because, of course, I'm spending all this time building software and I'm not doing what 99% of the vendors out there are doing. But thankfully, back in April, in fact, 2018, so just a few months ago, the Office of Civil Rights came out. So the Office of Civil Rights, they are the enforcers of HIPAA. So they're like the HIPAA police, if you want to call them that. They do a cybersecurity newsletter every month, and back in April, the April edition was all about the fact that they did this whole edition about the disconnect between the risk analysis and the risk assessment, which is what they call a gap analysis. Their findings In fact, you guys are going to recognize this chart, and the reason why that newsletter came out was because of this right here. So if you remember, you may have heard some of the buzz out there and the fear of the phase 2 audits or the HIPAA desk audits. This was back in 2016 and 17, where they were doing random audits, and not a very huge sample, but they did do some random audits of HIPAA compliance to see how people were doing. And right here, you'll see CE, that's covered entity, that's you, okay, as providers. What they found was 0% of practices were actually in compliance with the risk analysis, okay? And only 14% actually substantially got it, and then 86%, so 86% either minimally addressed it, were negligible, or there was no evidence at all of any kind of attempt to do a risk analysis. So these are really bad numbers, and the reason for that, and the reason why the cybersecurity newsletter came out in April, was to say, wow, part of this problem, and the business associates are in the same boat. Part of the problem is that they are noticing that all the consultants out there and the services that help doctors meet HIPAA compliance, they're offering a risk assessment versus the risk analysis. Again, two different things. I will show you what a real risk analysis look like. Okay. Moving along. So here's the annoying past, right? Remember, we all have this, we cringe when we hear HIPAA compliance, and I'm surprised we even have anybody on this webinar, because anything HIPAA makes everyone just want to run away. And here's why. I totally get it. I understand. Here's why. Because this is what HIPAA looks like in your office. This photograph is a real photograph of the chiropractor I go to. And when I was still in practice at the time. I am no longer in practice now. I do this full time, but I was in practice. We were about to launch our beta product, and I went to my chiropractor and I said, hey, would you guys beta test the compliance? And she said, well, I don't know. You have to go talk to Catherine. So I went to talk to Catherine, and I said, Catherine, I'm building this HIPAA product. It's going to help you meet compliance. And she goes, oh my gosh, where were you 2 years ago? But she points down on her desk, and this literally right there, so of course I had to take a picture of it. She goes, this is our compliance. She goes, every year I pull out my stack of binders. Here's your binder. She has seminar notes in here, and she has all this stuff like the staff training, etc. She goes, every year I pull this stack out, and it happened to be at the time I talked to her, and I try to go through this and remember what I need to do and figure out what I need to do and where do I document stuff. And she goes, it's a total nightmare. It takes way too much time. She goes, oh my gosh, thank you so much for building HIPAAmate. So consequently, they were a beta customer. But this here, it doesn't work. It hasn't worked for the last 10 years, and it won't just miraculously start to work, meaning buying manuals, buying stuff at seminars, trying to bring it home, or not home, but to your office and implement it. It doesn't work. And so there has to be a different way. At least I knew there had to be a different way. And I know there's a different way. So I created one. So the bright future, this is take 2 of HIPAA. It's software. Okay, it's going to be software. Now here's where all the problem begins, I should say. If you're aware of this or not, there's actually 3 different HIPAA rules. There's the privacy rule, there's the security rule, which is the big ugly one, right, that you don't like because it's so confusing. And then there's the breach notification rule. The security rule is the hardest one, and it involves the implementation of different types of safeguards, administrative, physical, and technical. And I am not going to bore you with what those are because it would be totally boring. Just know that there's a heck of a lot of them. The problem here, right, so this is it. It says the HIPAA requires you to implement these safeguards. You can learn about it. I'm doing a 4-hour seminar in Michigan this coming weekend. You can sit there and learn about all this stuff. It doesn't matter how much you learn or how much you read or how many videos you watch. It's implementation that is the only thing that matters, and it is the hardest part to do. And software is what, in my opinion, is the only thing that's going to fix it. And I'm going to show you that now. If you'll bear with me one moment, I'm going to exit this. We're going to jump in. So implementation, right? You can bring back a manual, or you can open up that big stack of papers every year, and it's the doing of HIPAA that's so challenging, which is why most of us end up not doing anything, or we fall on our face too many times, and so then we move on to other things like seeing patients, which is what you want to be doing, is seeing patients. So if we can have, or my intent was to build a tool that does the thinking for you, because I don't want you or your staff, the poor soul in your office that's being tasked with being, doing the HIPAA stuff, like Catherine at my chiropractic office, or my chiropractor's office, not chiropractic office. And she's faced with this thing every year that she has to do. Well, I decided, you know what, there's an easier way. It's called software. Don't think about it, just follow along. So this here is the home page of HIPAAmate. And when you create an account, you're brought to this page. And remember, we'll talk about, or I think you're going to get a link to the discount anyway at the end of this. But the idea is to have a spot where all of your HIPAA compliance is done, and it's all done. It's cloud-based. It's online. There's nothing to install. I'm going to point out one of the greatest things right here is support. Right? All customers always can ask questions at any time. Ask a question, hit submit. It comes right to us. We know who you are. We know what page you're looking at, so it's just easier to ask questions. Or you call. You should never be in a position where you don't know what to do. That does nobody any good. There's no way to be confident and comfortable with compliance if that is our goal, right? And then to not let you have the accessibility to ask questions and get your concerns figured out. So support's always free. That's included, of course. I mean, it's also how we help build a better product. If several people have the same question, then I know, hey, what can I do to tweak the software to have that not even be a question? So obviously this is helpful to us as well. But this is the dashboard. In HIPAA, I'm going to show you all what you actually need to do to become compliant. And you can, on your own, when I'm going through these different topics, you can go, oh, am I doing that, yes or no? Then, you don't have to try to sit there through a big, long, bladed seminar about what all the requirements are. Just look at this and you'll know that they are a requirement. I don't ever put anything in the software that is not a requirement, because that would be what? It would be a waste of time. So why do I want to waste your time? And everything has a purpose. So HIPAA, there are some things that are just considered lists. You have to have lists of your workforce, your inventory items, business associates. But this is the more important one, which is where software can become so powerful. If you remember Catherine's big stack of HIPAA paper, the reason she had such a difficult time every year is because she brought out the big stack of notebooks and seminar binders, et cetera. And she had to try to figure out where everything was and where the information was and what needs to be done. With software, I should say data-driven software, if the data is already known, if we know what it is, then we can help aid you in what is your next step. Like, we can do the thinking, or a lot of the thinking for you, which is where I'm ultimately going. Is I don't want you to try to figure it out. I just want the software to help you, tell you what to do, because that's what we all want. Just tell me what to do, get it done, and move on to see patients. So some things, as you're probably aware, are required on an annual basis, training being one of them. In this case, I can see that there is a training. There's, let me see if I can zoom in on this a little bit more for you guys. There we go. There's one training that's past due. I can see that my policies, remember how I said you have to have your policies have to be reviewed and approved on an annual basis? This is saying that, in another 69 days, I have to do that. Like a risk analysis, right? You have to do those every year, or at least every year, I should say. And I have a long time. I have over 300 days before I have to worry about it again. So these are things that are very good just at a snapshot, at a glance to look at. Okay. When somebody is new, the whole point of software, in my opinion, is to do things faster and smarter. So to do that, I've purposefully put these items in order so that because information builds on it. When you're, again, I don't want you knowing why or what the purpose of it is, but just know that there's a very specific reason for my ordering here. And when you're new to HIPAAmate, you would actually go down the list and you work through each area before you can move on to the next. For example, I can't let you do training until you've done your policies and procedures. Why? Because remember I said training is on your policy and procedure. So therefore, when I go to the training tab, it's actually pulling information from policy. So I do have there's like a reason for why we work down this order. But it's real simple. Location is just your practice name and address. Privacy officer, you do have to have a designated privacy officer. This is where you would include that information. And remember, so HIPAA can be, there's a lot of information. And unfortunately, you see lots of text on this page because there's a lot of information. And somebody may look at this and go, oh my gosh, that's a lot of different job responsibilities for your privacy officer. But I always put in the, throughout the software, I have little notes. And in this case, I'm saying, hey, note, this is like me talking to you or your privacy officer. It's not expected, nor is it reasonable for small healthcare practices to hire professionally educated IT people. HIPAA does not expect that. They totally understand that you might be an operation with 10 folks in it. You don't have a dedicated IT person that's going to be super expert at all this stuff. So I also say, of course, that we're going to make a great effort to make sure we provide guidance on all this. But one thing that you may or may not know with compliance is that you need to actually have job roles. You have to list a job role and the level of EPHI, or electronic protected health information is what that's called, basically patient information. The job role and what type of information is that job role, are they allowed to access? Okay, for example, like a biller may not have to see, well, probably clinical, but you click these on and off, and clicks, everything in our software, we do a lot of clicks because this is data, right? We can do stuff with this information later, whereas if it was free text, we can't. I'm going to skip logbook because that's really only if you're like making modifications, like physical modifications to your practice, but know that you can document that you're able to do that. Workforce. So this is where every person that is in your office that is considered a workforce member, the workforce is the term that HIPAA uses. Notice I don't say employee, because you could have a volunteer that comes in that is a workforce member. Workforce member is just somebody that is doing something in your office that involves the use of patient information, and they're under your direct control, or not, well, what's the right word? We'll say control, yeah, under your direct control. And a volunteer may be that, or maybe a spouse, right? A spouse might not be might not be a employee, but they're certainly workforce because they're in there and they're working on, within the office, performing duties that involve PHI. When you add workforce, part of a workforce list is obviously you know who they are, the role that they have in your office, what type of access do they have to electronic information, and then it's always good to know, are they up to date on training? Like in this case, Carl Jones here, this is where that one missing training is, or out of date training. Let's jump into inventory. So the next thing that you need to do, or that you should be doing, is you inventory your items, right? The media, as the term is used. So things like computers, hard drives if you have them, cell phones, etc., printers, all that kind of stuff. HIPAA would like you to, or well, requires that you have a list of these items, and it starts to make sense when you actually look at, well, why does a list matter, right? So let's look at some of the things that are required in a list. So when I add media, I'm just going to click on this one here to pretend I'm going to edit it. You want to know, or you want to list information. Well, what is it, right? It's a desktop. Give it identifier. Some people use serial numbers, but you can just, if it's small office, most of it, it's treatment room 1. It's the laptop that's in there. Where is it located day to day? All right, so I'm going to give you a scenario here in a little bit, but so here's the things we want to know about each device, right? Where is it located? Give it a name. Is it in a public area, like the waiting room? Maybe it's a check-in computer. Or when I was in practice the second time, it was just me. It was me, myself, and I. And I had this laptop that I'm on right now. I used my cell phone, and I have a printer and my router, internet router. That was everything, right? And guess what? I took that stuff home. So absolutely, it was in a public area, and that's okay. We just need to know it. What type of information is on it? Who's the device assigned to? Is it personally owned? Can staff use a personal cell phone to text a patient? Believe it or not, they can. This is a bigger discussion for later, but they absolutely can if your policies and procedures document allows that, if that employee has been given permission to do that, and if the patient has authorized that you can send basically PHI to their cell phone. Then yes, you can do that. But anyway, this is all information that we want to know. Does the device move outside the office? Because that increases risks, doesn't it? It's okay if it does. We just need to know that. All this information, these little tick boxes, play into risk management later. There's other questions we ask, like, is it, is there automatic log off on this device, like a cell phone, right? Does it like turn off or log out after 2 minutes of inactivity or something? What type of physical protections are in place? Is it password protected? Or does it have a fingerprint protection? Is it malware protected, antivirus? Is it encrypted? So all these questions that we ask They matter, A, because we need to ask them. That's what you need to do to document this stuff. Can you imagine trying to do this on a spreadsheet or in like a binder? There's no way. But you're going to see why this makes even more sense later. But this matters because HIPAA, if you look at it from a contingency plan or emergency operations standpoint, so God forbid, right? There's an well, you're in California. We'll use that there is a tornado or something that rips off treatment room 1. Well, it would probably be a very good idea to know what was in treatment room 1. You can very quickly look, oh, treatment room 1 right here, we had a MacBook Air. Okay, and you also need to know from a HIPAA standpoint is, okay, what was that MacBook Air, because it's now missing, it's gone, we don't know where it is, was it encrypted? And I can look at my documentation and go, oh, it was encrypted, great, that means I have no breach. You don't have to report a breach. So that's why this is so important, is to have all this information. It's not just something that's like busy work that HIPAA wants you to do. It actually has a purpose behind it, and it's a very good purpose. Okay, let's move on to business associates. You do need to maintain a list of business associates. Good news, it's super simple to do, which is really just who is it, their contact information, what's the required access, and do you have a signed BAA or business associate agreement, which, by the way, if you need one of those, we do have templates for those things. Very simple and straightforward. Policies and procedures. So this is, remember the old dusty binder that most offices have on there somewhere on a shelf that hasn't been touched in years. Well, guess what? The good news, I have this note here. You are not required to keep your policies and procedures in printed form. It's totally acceptable to keep them in electronic form. And that's what I recommend doing, because when was the last time a patient actually asked to see your policies and procedures? They don't ever. Your notice of privacy policy says that they could have a copy if they want to, or I'm sorry, they could look at it if they want to, but no one ever asks. By the way, your notice of privacy practices is not this. This is very different. If you have questions about a notice of privacy practices, I can actually show you an article to read on that, or just ask me questions later. Okay. So here we go. We've broken up your policies and procedures in your office. Could be different than this, but essentially the topics are going to be the same. We have it broken up into 20 different policies, that make up the manual. Remember how I said some policies can totally be generic across all practices? This is one of them. It's an introduction, but obviously we plug in your information, but there's nothing editable here. You just approve the policy, and you can see that when it was last approved. Remember the whole reviewing and approving? That's why these dates are important, to have it documented, is who approved it, the privacy officer, and when was that, so that you can always know, hey, look, it's been a year, I need to go ahead and hit the button again. Other policies do require customization. This would be one of them. Remember the password policy? I'll use this example again. So training, this leads into training. So you have to have a password management policy according to HIPAA. So voila, here it is, right? Where you, the practice owner, get to decide things like, what is the required minimum password length? Oh, we require, let's just put it to 10 passwords, and it can be upper and lowercase. Nope, you know what, we don't care. It can be all lowercase. And we have to change it every, year. No problem. Just hit approve. Okay, so that would be one that is a customizable one. Another one might be like data backup right here. You have to have a data backup procedure. What is that? I have no idea what that would be, so you have to tell me, right? Speaking of, I do, everywhere I know that an office or an office manager may have some, like to help clarify, I give examples of like, yeah, look, here's an example of a chiropractor that has, that uses an electronic health record, a cloud-based version. This would be an example of one of those. And here's an example of someone that has a server-based EHR. So that's always good to know. Okay. So again, some of these require a little bit of typing or drop-down menus, and a lot of them don't. For example, breach notification procedures, that is just it's the same for everybody. We all have the same breach notification procedure. So you just read it and boom, approve it and be done with it. Training, okay, so every year, staff, including the doctors, need to go through HIPAA training. That doesn't mean again, reading all of your policies. It just means there are specific things that need to be trained. And so when I was building this thing, I looked for all within the HHS, Health and Human Services guidance material out there for practices for healthcare providers, I went and I looked for all and any references I could find that related to training or staff training. And then I bundled them into 7 different topics. This last one is just a little smattering of a few that didn't really fit nicely in the others. So that's why it says other. But remember password training? Here, or password management training, here it is. So the reason videos online, again, don't work, I'm sorry, not that they don't work, but they're actually not compliant because, again, a video can't tell you, your office, how your office's password policy, or give you the specifics of your password policy versus, you know, the 10 other offices that are watching the same video. And HIPAA does call out, in fact, this is coming right from their guidance, you know, you do need to train staff on what's the minimum password length, you know, the complexity, how often it needs to be changed, etc. So anything in yellow is actually coming from the policies. This is a real short training. You can print these off, you know, put them in the staff mailboxes or something, and or just do a staff training. Most small offices just hold a couple of staff trainings to go over the, it's acting a little goofy because, there we go, to go over training. When a training, of course, the big thing, like anything in healthcare, right? Documentation is everything, is king. So you want to add a training event after you ever do a training, which is when did it occur? Who was the presenter? What password or what trainings were included in the training and who was in attendance, and you hit save. And that just goes into, I'm going to hit reports here real quick, go to the training reports. And if you're ever audited, which, you know, you won't be, right? No one's going to be audited. But if you were, they're going to ask you, they're going to want to see your training because training is hugely important from a HIPAA standpoint, compliance standpoint. And so here's your track record of all the different trainings that have occurred and when in your office. Very important. Activity review. So this, or I should say a systems or an information system activity review. That's the long of it, which is, I guess some consultants abbreviate it to the ISAR. So this needs to be done once a year. We, of course, walk you through that whole process of what to do. It's not very difficult. It might take you 5 minutes. Let's see here. Let's get into the most challenging part, or not challenging. Actually, it's very simple, as you're going to see, but it's the most complex where, remember that chart that I showed you earlier in the slideshow that said that the risk assessment and the risk analysis were not the same thing, and that when they did their audits, when the OCR did their audits in 2016 and 17, they found that 86% of offices were basically negligible, like they just weren't doing much of anything. This is what we're talking about, the risk analysis, okay? Most people are not doing this. When I show this to you, you're probably going to go, oh yeah, I'm not doing that. And that's okay. You can start doing it. It's super simple. This process that I'm going to show you, by the way, according to the Office of Civil Rights in that same cybersecurity newsletter, said that a good, solid, or an accurate and thorough risk analysis should take at least 20 hours to complete. Okay, if you were using that stack of paper that I showed you in that one slide and trying to do this thing on your own with just, I don't know, paper notes and a spreadsheet or something, yeah, sure, it would absolutely take you 20 hours. But I'm telling you, it does not take that long. It'll take a fraction of that. It'll take probably 20 minutes at most if you have software. And I should say, if you have software that is data-driven, that's the key, right? You can't just use software that documents stuff. It doesn't work because that's just, it's just documenting information. But if that information can be used to help you make decisions, which is what we built HIPAAmate to do, then it actually can be extremely helpful. So there's 3 steps to doing a risk analysis. I've already started one, but if I uncheck this, then you can see I can't move on. It won't let me move on. Okay, you have to manage. Well, the first step is just make sure that your workforce and your business associates are up to date. Remember, you'd only do this once a year. Or you do a risk analysis if something significant changes in your office. For example, you move offices. You want to do a new risk analysis because things are different, right? A different physical location, there's different environment that you're in. A lot of different stuff can change. Or another example would be if you decide to adopt an electronic health record. Maybe you haven't ever used one and now you're going to go with some vendor, you need to do another one. Or if you switch EHR vendors, do you want to do one? Good news is it literally just takes minutes. So again, make sure these are correct. You then manage threats and vulnerabilities. So if this looks unfamiliar, then you're probably thinking, okay, if you've done like a risk assessment is a bunch of yes, no questions. Have you, for example, do you have a list of your workforce? Do you inventory your EPHI items and know the safeguards that are on them? Do you have a list of business associates? So those are yes, no questions. That's part of a risk assessment. The reason that's silly, in my opinion, is because if you answer yes, you still have to have the list somewhere. And if you answer no, I don't have a list of business associates, you still have to have the list somewhere. So answering yes, no questions is a waste of time. What I decided to do was skip that, just go right to the doing part. Like I already know, like you don't need to do a risk assessment or a gap analysis. I know what the gap is, and I just immediately like fill the gap or the void, close the gap, I should say, by just having you go through HIPAAmate. So again, the biggest difference between, or how you can tell if you've done a risk assessment in the past or if you've done an actual risk analysis, is the threat vulnerability. That's how you identify a risk analysis. A risk analysis makes you, you're required to assess risk for each threat vulnerability combination. So that's what HIPAA calls it, a threat vulnerability combination. So the first thing you do is have to create a threat vulnerability combination list. The good news is you only focus your list on what you reasonably anticipate. Okay, so for example, out in California, you probably don't reasonably anticipate a tornado. I mean, that wouldn't be one, right? But maybe an earthquake might be one. I have a lot of stuff checked in this one. It's my demo, but or let's just say vandalism, right? You're in a high crime area. Okay, everything starts off unchecked, and you just go through and you check them, right? Okay, if you're concerned about human error in your practice, that's the threat, is human error. You open this up and you go, okay, oh yeah, you know what? We have an employee who is like always putting in data incorrectly, or you know what? In the last little bit, we've actually lost several keys, access points. So I'm gonna keep that one checked. We're just gonna do that. Then you hit save, and what this does is it creates, it's a new one, right? So these are threat vulnerability combinations, and now we have to assess or assign a risk level, that's what these are, to this. So your first time through this, again, most offices might have like 10 threat vulnerability combinations. Okay, so I'm gonna click start or hit this item. And now we assess, it's an okay example. I'll show you another one where there's a lot more data. But so here we have a threat vulnerability combination, a threat of human error. The vulnerability is losing keys or access cards. And so assigning risk is nothing more than a multiplication of the likelihood something is going to happen. So how likely is it that basically you're going to have losing keys, and multiplied by how bad that would be to your practice if it were to happen. And so we kind of give you an estimate, like, think of this as, not likely as about once every 10 years, or, oh, you know what, we do this like every year. We're always losing keys, or maybe even every month, right? But if we lose a key, we consider that the harm would be here. And then I give you ideas of what are different potential outcomes. So this creates a risk level of 10. If it was like a 3 and a 2, of course, it's a risk level of 6. We're going to keep it at a 5 just for fun. I'm going to hit save. By the way, so remember I talked about data-driven. And I want to make sure we have about 15 minutes, so I will wrap this up very soon so that we can have Q&A. Data-driven, the reason this process would take more than 20 hours is, first of all, just knowing threats and vulnerabilities, but it's this part right here. It's the likelihood. The only way to know how likely something is going to happen is if you know in your practice what the current things that you do to protect against that from happening and the things that aren't protecting. In this case, I can look at this and go, oh, look, I have an employee, Jonathan W., who has left my office, who no longer works, but I never collected a key from that person. That increased my risk, doesn't it? Right? And versus, oh, look, I've had these people all leave and I've collected their information. By the way, let me just show you very quickly. Workforce, here's removed, like people who have left the office. Like this person has pending tasks. When you remove a workforce from the office, an employee, or that someone who doesn't work for you anymore, you want to document, was the employment, was the determination amicable or hostile? Did they return the stuff that was assigned to them? Part of having an inventory of your workforce, it's what stuff do they have that to access information. So we know that, right? So we can ask you, hey, did you collect all this? Did you disable all their accounts, etc.? So that's where, again, this matters when we get to risk management. Let me continue with this one. I'm just going to really quickly hit save on this. Save, and I'm going to go to one. Let's go to theft. Let's do current. Let's do high crime area. Your business is just somewhere in high crime. So HIPAA says for you to answer this question, you have to know what you're currently doing in your office to protect against theft because of crime, and what things you could be doing that you're not doing, right? So we know that information because you've been entering stuff here. We can spoon feed you this, and you go, oh my gosh, look, I have certain things that are not behind locked doors. You can open up. I have an exam room HP that doesn't have a locked door. It's okay. You don't have to lock a door. You just need to know that there is something like that. Or encryption, encrypted hard drive. I have all this stuff has encrypted hard drive. But I have something that isn't. Right? These two things are not encrypted. So what that means is if a theft occurred, this matters because you could say, oh, you know what, I think theft is here. But if it were to happen, and I know that I have two devices that aren't encrypted, then that could be really bad. It could be bad in the sense that it's a pain in the butt to do breach notification stuff. You don't want to do that. So the whole point of software and data-driven is to give you exactly what you need to make a decision so you can move on with your life and go treat patients. But anyway, this all culminates in a risk analysis report, right? So if I hit review and approve, voila, we compile all the data, we throw it into a huge report, all your employees, business associates, the scope of the analysis, your risk vulnerability combinations. I put all the legal stuff or the jargon, it's in here for you don't have to try to figure out what to write. Here's all the stuff that you currently do to protect your PHI. Here's your likelihood, risk levels, et cetera. And then here's all the things that you don't do that you could do, right? And that's okay. We need to know that. That actually, this part, and then if you hit approve, that actually creates a report. Because of course, if you're ever audited, you want to see a risk analysis report. You just print these things off. If someone asks for them, you just print them off. Here you go, boom, done, end of story. Okay. Sorry, let me jump back to risk management. Okay. What's coming next, actually, we're in the middle of coding this right now, is remember the stuff that you're not doing that you could be doing, like encrypting those two. I had an HP and a laptop, something like that didn't have encryption on it. So part of a risk, or the second part of a risk analysis, or I should say not the second part, but the second part of risk management is to create a plan. In other words, create a plan. What is it that you're going to do to minimize risk if you need to? For example, encryption. We're going to say, hey, doc, there's two things that don't have encryption on them. What do you want to do? And you might say, oh, I'm not going to encrypt them, because you don't have to. Encryption is not a requirement under HIPAA. It's recommended, but it's not a requirement. So we would give you a choice and say, okay, do you want to encrypt these or not? You might go, yes, I'm going to. Awesome. We'll say, great. Who's going to do it? And when is it going to get done by? And then we're going to create a to-do item, right, that'll sit on the dashboard. If you decide not to encrypt it, this is very important. If you decide not to encrypt something, because remember, it's not a HIPAA requirement, then we're going to ask you very specific questions to make sure that it is documented, that you've documented the appropriate reason, because HIPAA allows 4 reasons why you don't have to do something if it's not required. And we will walk you through those 4 to make sure it's documented, so that if you're ever in a situation where you are audited and they say, you didn't encrypt that laptop, why didn't you? And you go, oh, let me look at my documentation. Oh, here it is. We did a risk analysis on this date. Here's where we did the plan, and I didn't encrypt it for X, Y, or Z reason, and that'll be appropriate. Documentation and proof. And then if something is required, remember, I'm making HIPAAmate so that you don't have to think about this stuff, or you don't have to figure it out. I already know what's required and what's not. If something is a requirement, then I won't let you say no. I'll say, okay, you have to select a date to get this done. But I don't want you trying to figure out which things are required and which aren't. Okay, so And again, key here is reports, documentation. So the idea is, again, make something as simple as possible, give you guys a tool. I'm going to show you, let's see if I can zip over. I just have to slide this over a second. To fix HIPAA compliance, and I'm going to open it up to questions. But to fix HIPAA, in my opinion, and I'm assuming probably yours too, it has to be simple, it has to be simplified, it has to be quick, and it has to be affordable. That's the key, right? If it's not affordable also, then guess what? You guys are going to go, great, I love HIPAAmate, it's great, it can protect my practice. You want how much money? I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to pay $2,000 to buy HIPAA, and I don't blame you. So I want to show everybody what our pricing is.
Okay, thank you,
Tom. Our pricing, yes, so our pricing is extremely, sorry, there's somebody talking. Pricing is extremely affordable because with software, we can service hundreds of clients at the exact same moment, right? So why should I be charging consulting prices when I'm not doing consulting, like one-on-one, face-to-face kind of stuff, right? Which is extremely inefficient. Software is super efficient. So you can see our pricing here. Most chiropractors fall within, an extra small, or a medium. Anyone who has more than that, we're still actually affordable. But these are our prices for an entire year.
Don't know. You think you got it?
These aren't prices. These are for an entire year. And the good news is, if you are a California Chiropractic Association member, you get 20% off for that first year. So it brings the price down significantly. But these are extremely affordable, and that's why I want it. I want everybody in the profession to be using HIPAAmate and to not worry about HIPAA. I don't just want the top 20%, right? The ones that have like huge successful practices that can afford, lavish software. This is for everybody. So with that, I'm going to open it up to questions if we have any. And I'm going to slide my little thing over to see if I can see what is there. I see there are some questions. Okay. Let's see. Okay. What is the cost? Okay, I just went over the cost of the software. So it's anywhere from, well, you saw the prices here. I'll throw the pricing page back on. There we go. Okay. I doubt anybody is in extra large or extra large, but if there are, then awesome. Actually, that's super cool. Okay, is there an instruction manual that comes with the software? Does it comment on the ramifications to the answers of the various questions asked, i.e. the EPHI inventory list? Sure. Okay, let me jump back in. So one of the things was, are there instructions? So a lot of pages, you see this help button down here? There's one here, there's one on business associates right here, and there's one in the risk management. I'm going to be adding more of these, but if you click that, it actually opens up a YouTube video where it's me explaining this page. And it's usually just me giving information that kind of like for questions that we tend to get asked. So that's the first thing for instructions, if you will. The other instructions come in the form of, well, this isn't the greatest. Let's go to a workforce, or no, an inventory item, sorry. I try to give instructions at the top of each page, or when we're adding media. I give little side things, like here's, I give little side information. There's always the support button, which is right here. If there's anything that you still don't know, just reach out. HIPAA is not something that's like urgent. It has to be done right now, but I do get back to you very quickly. And the other thing is, you said, is there, the ramifications, where was that? Yeah. The various ramifications, various questions. For example, there are notes. Like sometimes people will get worried. They'll say things like, oh my gosh, I'm answering no to this. Is that bad? And I put, no, it's okay to answer no. I know that some people are going to worry, like if I have this unchecked, is that bad? And I'm telling you right here, it's okay to answer no. The ramification stuff will be talked about in the risk management plan. So I will be saying, hey, encryption, right? Encryption right here. Is the hard drive encrypted? I give a little info button, encryption prevents unauthorized access, etc. This doesn't have a ton of information, but in the risk management plan, it'll tell you why encryption is important. It's important because if a device is encrypted and it's stolen or lost, there is no breach. HIPAA, you don't have to report it to anybody. So there are spots where we're going to kind of give you what the ramifications are of not doing something. But again, if the software doesn't have something that you want to know, you just reach out and we'll get an answer to you. Let's see, does training come with this? Yep, it does. Training is right here. Right now, the training is all via a text document, which again is most often done via a staff meeting or a couple of staff meetings, and it's done. We are going to turn a couple of these into video, like sanction policy and breach notification. Those are going to be videos as well as an option because those are generic across all practices, whereas password management training can't be a video because again, it's specific to your office. We're also going to do some other fun, fancy stuff with this later where the training will automatically get emailed to your workforce and they can watch it or read it on their own, hit a button within the email, and that'll automatically create a training event, but that's not coming till later. Let's see here. Oh, and then that person also asked about are they designated trained? So as soon as a training event is created, there's nothing in the HIPAA rule, and I've looked at this a lot, that states that your staff have to sign, like literally physically sign a training document to prove that they did it. It is perfectly acceptable to have your designated privacy officer attest to the fact that the training was done, and that's what's done when you add a training event. Okay, it's not as hard as you think. You just click, click, click. You hit save, and that is proving, if you will, that the person was wrong. Let's see here. Someone said wrong. The compliance manual must have I'm not sure, maybe a signature? Compliance manual. I don't know, someone's saying something is wrong. All your employees must sign off. Oh, compliance. No, actually, there's nowhere in there that your training, remember, is on your policies and procedures, specific components of it, but they do not have to actually physically sign a document stating that they did it. The signature, the attestation is coming from your office. Your privacy officer, which this is their job to do the HIPAA training, they are documenting that they did the training, and by signing off on the training event, that is the signature. I will look into that because this person says that I'm wrong, so I'll look into that. But if there is a spot where you need to actually get a physical signature of a staff person for the training, I'm sorry, not for the manual, that would be news to me. Okay, sorry, there might have been another one besides employees. Do you add people like interns and spouses? Okay, so if a spouse is actually working in your office and doing stuff, that involves patient information, which I'm sure they would, then yes, they are a workforce. Same thing with an intern. Well, let me think about the intern thing, because the intern, if they're still a student in a school, that's a little more convoluted because you don't actually have direct control over their like what they're doing. So in that scenario, I would still consider that the school is responsible for that student's HIPAA compliance training. And what you would want to do is have a confidentiality agreement signed with the student or the school. That would make more sense to me than them being an actual workforce, because again, you don't have direct control over their what they're doing. Let's see here. Sorry, I'm getting a little lost with some of the questions. Let's see here. The cost as in, the size stuff, so cost. So these are for workforce members, right? So if you have like between 4, or you can have 4 to 10 workforce. So a workforce would be the doctor and basically, staff, front desk, whoever, biller, to work in the office. If it's somebody who is a business associate, like a massage therapist that is not an employee, right? They're not an employee, they're an independent contractor, they are not a workforce for you. They need to be HIPAA compliant, especially if they're doing work on your behalf. You want to have a business associate agreement with them. And within HIPAAmate, you can have as many business associates as you want to. Let's see here. Does the software pop up on the screen to notify you to train? Okay. So they're asking about notifications. So we launched, 10 months ago. So right now, this is the notification. Where we're going, though, is we are building features, or we will be next year, to where there will be notifications of, like, for example, risk. Let's say you have like 2 to-do items, things you need to do, like get your laptop encrypted or something like that. We'll have a little notification here. The other thing that's even more important is sending automatic emails to the privacy officer or the business owner, letting them know when something's about to be due, right? Like, let's say the policies that they're overdue, is like boom, or within 30 days, say, hey, on the next 30 days, go in and reapprove your policies. Okay. Let's see here. Not the manual, but the HIPAA compliance. Oh, let's see. Not the manual, but the HIPAA compliance. All BAs employees must be trained and signed. So So all this person is this is the signature stuff. So HIPAA compliant. Okay, an employee. Here's what an employee must sign. They have to sign a sanction policy. Period. End of story. Right? They must do that. That is something that has to be signed. Is your sanction policy, which is one of your policies, right? And use a generic, use the standard HIPAA one. It makes perfect sense. Let's see here. BAAs, business associates, must sign a business associate agreement, right? Employees must be trained on all of these topics, but unless somebody can point out to me where directly from HHS it specifically states that training has to be signed by the employee themselves, then of course I will change the software, but I have never seen that. Staff have to be trained, and the privacy officer or the business owner has to attest that training has occurred. Let's see, are you personally a CHPA? I am a HIPAA certified, let's see, what is it? I don't even know. I don't even usually say it much. It is, it's through PMRNC, which is like the Practice Managers something network. But yes, I did take a test to be a HIPAA. It's not a CHP, but it is one of the HIPAA certifications. There's a whole bunch of them out there. So yes, I am certified. I think that was the last question. And I'm sure it is now 4 o'clock. Okay. Or, well, 4 o'clock my time. Sorry, 1 o'clock your time.
Okay, Dr. Brown, I want to thank you so much for providing this information to our doctors. And if anyone has any follow-up questions, feel free to email myself or Dr. Brown directly on his HIPAAmate software. Dr. Brown, do you just want to give your email address really quickly?
Sure. Yep, it is. I can just go right over here so you guys can see it. Where is it? Right here. I'll zoom in. There it is, right there.
Perfect. Okay.
HIPAAmate@gmail.com. Yep.
Awesome. Well,
all righty.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and have a wonderful day.
Great. Thank you. Bye-bye.